Well, good morning all, and welcome again to St. Matthew's. In this midst of ordinary time, in the midst of a hot July, I would like to welcome again all of you who are visiting St. Matthew's. I put in the chat box an email that an address you can send an email to where you can get to know us more if you'd like to join our community or get more involved with our events. So thank you for being here, and thank you everybody in the parish for joining us this Sunday. I know that Zoom worship is not what we all aspire to when we became members of St. Matthew's, but it's a way that we can go on and sustaining and feeding our common life. So I hope this is beneficial and edifying to you, and your being here is also edifying to others. And so thank you for supporting the parish, being here this time. We have the gospel about the wheat and the tares, and the wheat and the weed. And as a preacher, I love it when Jesus himself provides his own commentary on the gospel. Sort of my job is done. Just listen to what Jesus said and you kind of understand the gospel, and then we can go on. Of course, I think maybe it's up to me to apply it a little bit to our parish situation. But we have this gospel where about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like this. And whenever you hear that word, the kingdom of heaven, you think, okay, this is what the church is like. Jesus is saying, this is what we're trying to do in the church. This is what it's going to be like among us. And you wonder about that also with yourself and your own life. This is what the kingdom of heaven looks like in your soul, in your spiritual life. And it can also be about how we live together politically and socially. He says, this is what it's like. So there's this good seed and it springs up and there's lots of wheat there, but the evil one gets in and puts the bad seed in, and the workers get all upset and they come to the Lord and they say, Lord, should we get rid of all these tares, all this, what was the weed the Shanleys were talking about earlier? The noxious, the sedge. Should we get rid of all this sedge? and the Shanleys told me that when you pull up sedge in your field, it actually bursts out in different kinds of seed pods and makes even more sedge. So it's a good analogy for today. But they want to pull up all the tares, all the wheat in the field, and the master says, no, don't do that, because if you do that, you're going to damage the roots of the good plants. So for now, they're going to grow up together, and they're going to continue together side by side, even perhaps to the lessening of the flourishing of the wheat, right? Because you have all those weeds in there, all those tares. The wheat isn't going to grow apparently as much, but it's better than uprooting them. And at the end of time, God will take care of it. God will make the judgment. And that reminds me a little bit of St. Paul saying in his letters, who are you to judge your fellow Christians? Who are you to uproot your fellow Christians and toss them out of the kingdom? You are here to judge nobody. They're a servant of God, and God will judge them. Who are you to judge somebody else's servant on what they're doing? Has that kind of character to it. But there's also a poignancy to this. There's a poignancy to these guys who run to the master and say, let's uproot all these terrible weeds. Because we long and we groan, as St. Paul says, for fulfillment. We want fulfillment. We want to be satisfied. We want to reach the end. And we think that our fulfillment's going to come through purity. So there can be this longing for purity. If we just get rid of all the bad stuff, of all the stuff that's appearing to stop my flourishing, then I'll finally be fulfilled. Just help me get rid of all the bad stuff that shouldn't be there. And then we'll be happy. Then we'll be fulfilled. A longing for purity. But Jesus in this gospel is showing us a much different way. Remember that Jesus himself was removed, was uprooted in the righteous zeal of his time and tossed out. He shows us a different way of living alongside and living with all that seems wrong and that seems perhaps destructive It's not our job to uproot it, to get rid of it, but to continue in our life as the wheat, insofar as we have it, and that God himself will take care of it at the end. And for me personally, if I speak personally, this is a relief, because my life is not a life of purity, and it's not a life of perfection, and it's not a life of unalloyed kingdom of heaven. It's all mixed up in me. And so I can hear this gospel as a bit of a consolation, saying that that's okay. You know, God's going to take care of it in God's good time. God will take care of it. God will eventually remove some of those weeds. And there's a message here about how we as a parish community deal with things in our present community or in our past that seem to be growth from the evil one, seem to be evil. How do we deal with that? How do we live with that? And I'll come back to that at the end. That's where we're going. I want to first address an important question: is can we even tell the difference between the wheat and the tares? The old gospel preachers would often point out that tares, the old-fashioned word for this passage, for the weeds, looks a lot like wheat before it is harvestable. Can we even tell the difference between the wheat and the tares? And I'll follow Amy Peterson, her wonderful sermon from last week, and do a little gospel analogy. I mean, a garden analogy. In the monastery garden, my pride was 32 row feet of snap peas, sugar snap peas. And we grew the tall kind, the kind that grew up 7 feet tall on these gigantic trellises, 32 row feet of these things. But in the pasture in which we had our garden, we had a serious bindweed problem, right? And so every year the bindweed would find those trellises, because bindweed grows by its roots, and it would get into the trellises and begin to grow up. And bindweed, though, is also called wild morning glory because of its beautiful white flowers. It flourishes on my trellises, you know, and I could go in and I could snip it off at the ground level. But of course it spreads by roots, so it would just grow up elsewhere. And I'd have to live with it for the whole season, because if I try to go after it, I would kill my snap peas. So this gospel makes a lot of practical sense for me as a gardener at that time, but it also points out there's different kinds of flourishing in this world. There's different kinds of flourishing. There's bindweed flourishing, which is beautiful, looks beautiful and glorious and attractive, and is very vigorous and strong, but takes away from the fruit of the kingdom, the sugar snap peas, which have much more fragile little blossoms and a fragile life. So I want to contrast these two different kinds of flourishing, because we all are playing with these different ways of flourishing in our life. There's a flourishing that human beings experience when we surrender to God, and when we let go of some of our self-concern and let God begin to work through us. And in the lives around us and the relationships we have, there's a real flourishing as we surrender to God and let God work through us. And people experience that, and it's a joyous thing. But there's also the flourishing that human beings experience when we win, when we have success, when we achieve something. And the Greek word for this was doxa, or glory. And it was originally applied, I find this fascinating, to the athletes who win the race. And we experience that with Michael Phelps and with others, and they win the race, and for a moment they have kind of a divine glory of complete fulfillment. They are resplendent in their victory, and they are there, and they finally made it to the top, you know. And then they get caught for using drugs and driving, but for the moment they seem like they are on the top. They have a godly light to them. And in our culture, we experience doxa like this. I experienced that when I kicked the ball all the way across the field and it goes in the goal. I feel like finally I've made it for a moment. But we also experience it at Walmart when we finally buy that 62-inch flat screen TV and you see people walking out of Walmart and they have this kind of this fulfillment to them as they push the flat screen TV to their car. And even more glory when we get it correctly mounted on the wall, right? And we understand the controls. Through acquisition, through getting things, through winning, through prevailing, through power, through security, through fame, through having people adore you and look at you and admire you. It's all part of worldly doxa, worldly flourishing. And we're all involved in that. We're all kind of seeking that in some way. And I'm reminded of the alternate music star Moby, who said in an interview that fame is a terrible thing because you sacrifice your entire life to get it, and then when you get it, it's horrible. And that's kind of what idol worship looks like. You sacrifice everything to get it, and it kills you when you got it. The divine flourishing from Jesus, the kind of flourishing we can experience with Jesus and walking his way with his Spirit, is again that life of letting go. It can feel really downwardly mobile. It can feel it can look to the world like poverty. It can look a bit like losing. It can look a bit like vulnerability, like ignominy. But it's the grace, or it's the flourishing of charis, of grace in our lives. And even though it might look like poverty or losing or having less, it opens up the life of the kingdom. That letting go to God and letting God be present allows us to be more sensitive, more attuned, more compassionate, more attentive to those around us. So there's a different kind of life. The Spirit can begin to move through us. And I find it fascinating as I look at my life and I see both kinds of flourishing completely interwoven in my life. And like being a rector, I want to be a success as a rector, yes. But I'm also trying to surrender to God and surrender to Jesus at the same time. And it's really hard to unweave these things. But I do know that I can see the signs of God's way of flourishing in my life when the people closest to me also flourish. You see, bindweed chokes out the life that it grows next to. And God's way of flourishing allows the people closest to you to flourish and to grow. So if I ask myself, how am I doing with the kingdom of heaven or the worldly kingdom? I can look to those people closest to me and around me and wonder how they are doing. The church exists to invite you into this different way of flourishing, and to not to uproot all that you've been, but to begin to nurture that different way of flourishing and to begin to give that more life for you and more strength. That's what we are on the mission to do. And we know the church has also failed in the past, that it's been supportive of the other kinds of human flourishing, the Doxa flourishing, I'm calling it. And it's also allowed people to live with split lives, so that you get your righteousness, your sense of righteousness and upstandingness in church, and then go on to do really horrible things the other 6 days of the week. And the church did this, and particularly in the South, around slavery, in its support of slavery. That it allowed people to have a sense of their own righteousness and to cut off and be disconnected from what they were doing to other human beings at the same time. And that brings me back to where I started, which was how we as a parish deal with the weeds in our parish fold. You see, being a member of St. Matthew's means not only that you have to live with the people you can see in the pew next to you, people you might think really are tares and probably should be uprooted. Why doesn't the rector talk to that person and ask them to sing a little more softly, for God's sake? But we also have to live with everybody in our parish family. And that includes people present and people past, right? It includes everybody in the parish family. It's a mystical communion. And we have the past. We have Thomas Ruffin, right, who was junior warden, gave the land to the parish, righteous and upstanding, and whose practice of slavery was also seen as a matter of scandal to other local slave owners because of the extreme cruelty and insensitivity with which he practiced it. All right. So this man is right in the middle of our parish life. And we have a temptation, I think, to want to eradicate that, get rid of that, pull that weed out, destroy that, whitewash that, or at least just politely don't ever talk about it, right? We don't want to go there. And I know that in talking about Thomas Ruffin in this sermon, I'm walking on like eggshells, and sure going to crack a couple eggs here, and I'm just trying to be careful. I do want to say though, what I'm talking about doesn't directly apply to the issue of the renaming, right? We may choose to rename, and we may well choose to rename the Ruffin House because of whether it hinders or helps our mission, right? It's not whether it's abstractly good or abstractly bad or how we feel about it, but we have a mission to restore all people to unity with themselves, each other, and God. That's the mission of the church, or to feed others out of the abundance of God's grace, as we've said as a parish. And the question is, does having our administrative building named that way help or hinder that mission? I think that's the question that we're looking at, and the vestry will be exploring this coming Tuesday. Prayers, please, for the vestry. But really looking about what we do with Ruffin, we have this guy in our past, and the gospel says we shouldn't try to get rid of that. And that can seem like a horrible loss or a wounding or a weakness. But you know, we hear in the Bible a lot about how weakness is our strength and how dying is our life, and how shame can be our honor. And that all seems like a bunch of sentimental and mystical gobbledygook, really, unless you get a sense of what the kingdom's actually about. And having the vulnerability and having the pain and even the shame of Ruffin as part of our family opens up a sensitivity in us. That very pain, that very sense of a wound, opens a sensitivity up in us that makes us able to care for other people more deeply, and to care for our African American neighbors, our Latino neighbors, all those who are oppressed or currently enslaved in wrong systems. You see, it drives us into a new sensitivity and new active compassion in our world. So having Ruffin here as part of this parish is going to be our strength in forcing us into a place of profound sensitivity to these issues, and really reaching out to our neighbors, and really doing that work of restoring people to unity, seeking conciliation with the Black community and the brown community. So, brothers and sisters, we are all messed up, as it were. We are all not messed up, but we are all kind of muddy with the kingdom. We got some kingdom growing in us, and we got some of this human world flourishing in us, and gradually, ever so gradually, as a church, we're trying to avoid that instinct for purity and to destroy what seems wrong, but to just leave that to God and to let that carry us into new compassion, new sensitivity, and new action for God's kingdom in this world. And God is doing that. And I see that in your faces, in your presence, in your care. And we will go forward with Jesus on this way. Amen.